Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. Find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back. I've got Ann Simonds, who has been in and around the whole horse thing for a even though she's only 28, a very, very long time, because she began in her minus years. I met her through our great mutual friend, Linda Tellington-Jones, who is a great hero of mine and probably of most people listening and watching. She's been saying to me for ages, you've got to go talk to Marianne, got to go talk to Marianne. And so finally we did. We found ourselves in Florida. And Marianne lives there in the belly of the beast of the horse industry near Wellington, Florida. But her work over the last few decades has been of great value to those of us who interact human to horse in any way at all. She's worked, with people as diverse as the FEI and also studying wild horses and Mustangs, graduate degree in consciousness studies, developing stress management products for horses and humans. She has campaigned tirelessly for better outcomes for horses in the sport industry. As I say, she's there in Wellington, which is the sort of center nowadays of the sport industry in the world, at least in the winter. She's an ecotourism pioneer. She basically stands, I would say, for nature in the mind, with a bit of an emphasis on the horse, as do many of us. So what a treat to have her on the show to enlighten us and talk to us about all the stuff we love to talk about and love to learn more about. And she also has a new book. She has many, many books, but she has a new book called A Horse by Nature, which she's going to talk about, hopefully. And okay, I've rambled. So, Marianne, thank you for coming on. Who are you and what do you do and why do you do it?
Oh, thanks, Rupert. Well, since we had a nice short visit when you stopped by in Florida of 4.5 hours or so, we never stopped talking about the touch points that we have. And, I think like a lot of kids that grow up aware, and I see so many of these young people nowadays that are aware, and they just sort of go through life waiting till they can get grown up enough to do what they're here to do. And I was one of those kids. I was adopted. So I kept thinking, well, maybe that's the problem. But I didn't think like my parents. And I loved nature and I loved horses. And my whole therapy in my life was outside playing by myself in nature. And nothing made me worry. I never worried. I was one of those kids that made oleander tea only to be told if I drank it after I drank it that I'd be in the hospital. But surprise, I did drink it and I wasn't in the hospital. Not that I'm telling you to go drink oleander tea. That was a dumb thing. But
why did you drink oleander tea?
Well, it was pretty. The flowers were pretty. And I was like 5 or 6, maybe 7. And I thought, I'm going to make my special herbal recipe, And so I'm outside playing, picking flowers and putting them in water and drinking my herbal teas and realizing that maybe I should learn something about plants. But at that stage, they were just my friends. They didn't have names. I didn't know what they were. I didn't have a family that taught me much about biology or nature, although we did do a lot of outdoor stuff. And I was fortunate. I got a horse when I was 5, but I got to start, basically riding lessons at 4 and then sponsoring horses. And just, it was an addiction. You're born with the horse gene. And I'm sure people can relate to that even if you don't have a horse in your life, there are people out there who feel like they need to have horse energy. So I grew up, and luckily my parents supported me, and I grew up in the hunter-jumper world, but we did everything with the horses. We would go off and play, football in the mud with our horses and go up and herd cows in the hills, and then we'd go to the horse show in Santa Barbara. So it was back when horses were your friends and you did everything with them, and sport was one of them. So I was very fortunate.
This was a California upbringing, correct?
In California. And one of the things that I noticed in the sport horse world, even back then as an 11-year-old, is that people couldn't hear what horses were saying. And I would hear them. And of course, as a child, you have no idea how you're hearing something. Where is that coming from? And there was one particular time in Santa Barbara where a trainer had been trying to keep a horse's head down, and they just kept trying different bits and put draw reins on. And finally, the horse is still throwing its head. And the trainer had the person take a crop and hit it between the ears, and the horse fell to its knees and rolled its eyes back. And I'm like 11, so I'm kind of scared. I go over and I'm crying. And I said, why would you hit a horse with a headache? And the look that the trainer gave me was shock. I mean, he put the horse away. But I realized then and there as an 11-year-old that he didn't know. He couldn't tell. And so my question was, and this was my pursuit, how do I know what I know? How do I prove that I know what I know? And how do I teach others that same channel of communication and connection? And so it's been a lifelong pursuit. And it doesn't end with horses because, as you mentioned, it's nature in the mind. We're humans by nature. And as conscious beings, we have the capability to share that energy at any level of nature we want. And horses happen to be one that enjoys sharing it with us.
A question. So you said you were adopted and you said that you didn't always see eye to eye with your folks, but your folks clearly valued horses and, supported your endeavors with horses. Were they horsey? Was this something that was important to them as well?
A
And
bit.
what did you differ in thinking from them on why do you think you found a place of harmony with them over the horses? Why did they support you?
Hmm. Well, they love me, obviously. I was adopted. My brother was adopted. And so when I started going horse, every birthday, Christmas, I want a horse, I want a pony, I want a horse. They thought I was kidding, but when they realized it really was serious, they did let me take lessons. And I say I was different. I always knew they loved me very much, but they did not come from a horse background at all. So they didn't really understand where it came from. I mean, to the extent my mother, part of her life, she grew up on the XIT ranch in Texas, but that was just horrible memories for her, living on a big cattle ranch as a teenager in the Dust Bowl of Texas. It was not something she wanted to talk about, having to ride a horse to go pick up the mail. And so horses were not something that appealed to her. But both my parents were animal people in that, I could convince them we need dogs and with cats we couldn't do, but salamanders and mynah birds. And, I was constantly bringing things home that needed rescuing. And they were very tolerant of all that. So I didn't grow up in an animal unfriendly. It's just I had a limit on what I could have. So I was very fortunate to get a horse early on. And I think because they did love me, they realized that was where my soul was. That's where I needed to be. And it's, I think what maybe my husband after 50 years might disagree with you a little bit, but I feel like that experience of being around horses and being with horses my whole life helped me turn out to be as functional as I am, because many a psychologist has looked at my background and said, you should not be functional. You're still holding things on. Let's do past life regression and find out what it is. And lo and
Why
behold,
should you not be functional? What's going on?
well, I think that's because that's the paradigm that if someone, the attitude, I think, in our modern day society is that we reflect our parents. It's sort of the Freudian approach versus Jungian approach. And even as a small child, my feeling was, I got here, now let me get to work. I didn't hold any judgment against my parents. They did the best job they could. I had no interest in finding my biological mother.
Mm.
She has her own life. She made her choices. I truly felt like I got here, I got to hit the ground running. So I was very eager to get out of school and start developing the tools that were already innately in me. And I want to say my determination, because I look back and I think I wasn't one of those smiley kids all the time. I was like, that I don't agree with you. But I learned to not disagree with parents and adults. So I was one of those, overachievers that got straight A's and just like, let me get out of here. And found that I was bucking the scientific paradigm in undergraduate school, showing how our scientific method for observations is affecting the system, therefore it's inaccurate. and that was part of my undergraduate thesis at Wyoming, is that when we look at the system, we affect it. But when we look with the system and are a passive participant, we can observe and we get a more accurate observation. So I did a whole studies around that.
Okay, so you did stuff with horses, not so much with your family, but presumably then with some sort of adopted or chosen family at the barn or barns that you were at. You said you played football with them in the mud and then went to the horse show. So you got this aspect of just sort of joy with horses, but also some experience in showing horses, presumably jumping. Then you go through school, you go off to college. And what do you study at college? And do you manage to keep horses going in your life while you're over there in undergrad land? Because that's not always so easy.
Absolutely. I started at the University of California, Irvine, and
Mm-hmm.
which is where I met my husband, and realized that they were quite academic, which was fine. But my first ecology field trip out into the desert, I was rather shocked when the professor killed all the rattlesnakes. And here we are supposed to study rattlesnakes and mice. I mean, it's in a desert ecology class, right? I'm a freshman. And so I asked and said, why did you kill all the rattlesnakes? And they said, well, it's a safety reason and we were sleeping in a cabin anyway, so I didn't see the need. Anyway, I got very upset about that. And I said I'd rather sleep out with rattlesnakes than with rattlesnake killers. So
That
that
made you
did,
popular. Yeah.
yeah, not popular. I had to sign a waiver. Luckily, I was 18, just turned 18, so it was legal. And the professor told me, what I'm going to find. And he was accurate. At about 5:45 in the morning, I could feel the rattlesnakes under my down sleeping bag, but they're reptiles. They're cold. They can't move in the morning. So I move slow, they move slow. And it was, I guess you'd say, the first cognitive communication exchange I had with rattlesnakes. And that one really stuck with me because I was so apologetic because when I went up on the top of the mountain to meditate, I almost stepped on one and just like a wheel, it just sort of jumped up and rolled over and sat on a rock. And I thought, wow, I almost stepped on you and you did nothing. And I was just so heartfelt, I guess. And this snake with this little black tongue, his little black eyes is just looking at me. It can't strike, it's too cold. And we just talked. And I was crying and sad and wondering why people want to kill everything. I still had this very naive, I guess, childhood feeling. And I thought, you know what? I like my feeling. I like being able to feel safe walking out in nature and not afraid. So I really never adopted the whole fear thing. But I realized I did not belong in the University of California system because they did not like my thinking. It wasn't going along with their thinking, where it's fine to test research animals and it's fine all in the name of humans. And I thought, I need to go study wild horses. So off to Wyoming I went. And luckily, my advisory professor at the time, Dr. Dennison, he agreed that wild horses are wildlife. So if you want to study wild horses, that's fine. So I did a double degree. I did it in range management, which is the School of Agriculture, and then wildlife biology, wildlife management in the School of Science. And so that also puzzled me. You can get a whole degree in wildlife management and never know what an animal eats. I just didn't understand. So I took range, so I knew all the plants, so I knew what the horses were eating. And the range attitude were all ranchers and cattlemen, so they were very much against horses. So I got both sides, and I was the only girl in both degrees. So but it never occurred to me that it would be difficult. I guess it's the same thing. I didn't have that belief system. I just went along my merrily way, getting my degrees, but living out in the field and studying wildlife and studying wild horses. It was great.
How is it that one can get a wildlife management degree and not know what the wildlife eats? Is
Yeah,
that really
well,
true?
and yours in Wyoming at the time, you could take a botany class and you might know that, a horse is an herbivore, and you might know that deer and elk eat certain shrubs, but you don't necessarily have to learn how to identify them. And in range management, because you're looking at carrying capacity and how much forage is produced and
Mm.
who competition with, you actually have to know, is that Western wheatgrass or is it crested wheatgrass? And if you don't know the difference, and I did not when I started, but all the ranchers I was in school with, they all could look at a little tiny piece of straw and go, oh, that's crested wheatgrass. I'm like, how do you know that? How do you know that? Well, it's got a little fluffy thing on the glue. So I learned to go through a lot of scat and manure and look at what animals were eating. And I think did a lot of diet overlap studies with horses. And at least in my studies, there was more overlap in some of the habitats with elk than there were with cattle. So it was a bit of a false statistical analysis to say horses have competition with cattle. They do in certain habitats, but in a lot of them, they don't eat. Like horses eat Western wheatgrass, cattle eat crested wheatgrass. Horses will eat certain species, cattle won't. Cattle will eat certain things.
It's interesting that that wasn't a given. I mean, when I was growing up in the UK, one would always put cattle. It's sort of a dying thing now. But we didn't keep cattle, but we would always have our neighbors who had cattle put their cattle on in spring for about 3 months because they would eat all the stuff the horses wouldn't eat. And this was just kind of a known thing. It still is so. So it's interesting that even somewhere like Wyoming at a university and sort of where ranching certainly was, the thing, that wouldn't necessarily be known. Or maybe the ranchers knew it, but the biologists didn't, or
Well,
where
I
was the
think
disconnect?
I think the disconnect was in Wyoming at the time. Most people going into wildlife management, wildlife conservation management, they were there as game wardens. How many elk you can shoot, so it really didn't matter too much what it ate. They weren't studying its natural behavioral ecology of an animal. Where I was in more behavioral ecology, understanding how the habitats affect the behavior of animals. And then if you're in range management, you didn't even want horses out there. So you didn't even care about them. You probably cared more about rabbits and locusts than horses at the time.
And why would you not have wanted horses out there if you were in range management?
Well, there was, again, a paradigm attitude that horses were not natives. They were feral. Somebody turned them out, and they are better at surviving than a lot of the livestock. So they wanted them off the land so that the public lands belonged to private landowners as opposed to the public. And with the paleontological data and other data, there was certainly sufficient evidence to show that genetically, the horses that are out there, I mean, yes, you could say a lot of them were ranch horses and they did come from the Spanish, but there was also genetic variability that showed that, for instance, there was a lot of Iberian blood in a number of them, like the Kygers and things. And when you look at the Spanish and when they came over, and there's a lot of disconnect in ship records showing that horses, were here with Native Americans and spotted horses 14 years after supposedly Columbus landed. It's like, how did that even happen? And so you start putting things together, and a lot of the data on the horse bones of Equus caballos, Equitundrii would disappear if they started getting second lab verification. And so yeah, it's a very interesting time. I'm trying to prove that the
Are
horse.
you suggesting? I know that this is current these days, particularly from the American side. It seems to be important to people to suggest that horses were there before the conquistadors. Are you taking that position?
I think that there were certain horses there before the conquistadors, and that's based on multiple points of evidence, including interviewing native tribes, that their stories go back to pre-conquistadors, and their stories of the horse and the fact that, you go down to the Chiricahuas in Arizona and their language, the Chiricahua Apaches, is more similar to Chinese than it is.
Well, no doubt. I mean, one could say this is just a sort of nerd out here. I mean, one could say that the Athabascan languages of the Native American peoples are extremely close to the Siberian, and that would make complete sense, with the land bridge. And it would make sense that we know that there's a fossil record of horses in North America for sure, but there does seem to have been a gap, which we don't know why. But why did they go across to Eurasia? We don't know. I myself, I have to say, I'm on team skeptical about they were there before the conquistadors, because I see all sorts of political and cultural and aspirational reasons why that might be important for somebody. But to me, I'm afraid it does seem like mythology. But I know that me just saying that means I'll get jumped all over now on YouTube by like 1,000 people saying,
Well, that's
Rupert,
okay.
you're
That means
full
they're
of
listening.
beep because, blah, blah, blah. But the very fact that people get so emotional about it strikes me as odd. But then again, you see, I don't take a side one way or the other really, because I'm not fully European. My family's colonial African. And so it doesn't really matter to me whether the conquistadors, whether they were there before or not. But having studied I was a medieval historian. I read an awful lot of the accounts of the early Spanish over there. I think if they had been horses there, they'd have said so because they're horse people. But anyway, whether or not it's true.
I don't think it's not a relevant thing at this
Yeah.
point, but I did find I like data. Okay, so I just collect data, and I did find it interesting that a paleontologist that I went to school with in Wyoming kept finding bones that were dated post-Pleistocene, pre-Columbian, and they kept getting it verified, and then those bones would disappear. I found that really interesting. I also
Sure,
found
no, absolutely. And there does seem to be this sort of
the Chinese road going through Wyoming and Colorado with all the artifacts and things. I mean, it's just, you pull data together. You can't say, but genetics don't typically lie, although
mm,
I won't say they won't because we've come a long way in genetics. But to that point that you're making, it's irrelevant because from a wildlife standpoint, Roosevelt elk, they're introduced into the state of Washington, but they're considered wildlife. Why? Because you can shoot them.
well, I think this is why it's relevant. I guess that's perhaps why I'm harping on it, is because I think from the wildlife management point of view, of course, the people who are trying to either restore or conserve the as close to the pre-Columbian rangeland as is possible to do now will feel very strongly anti-Mustang. I myself am surprised by that because although I am skeptical that the horses were there pre-Columbus, my skepticism only matters in that I can understand why the conservationists take that attitude, and at the same time, because this is a 600, almost 700-year-old history at this point of Europeans in North America, with our livestock having gone over there that long ago, is it not now a moot point? The same thing as, for example, I lived in Texas for a long time, and people were all anti-feral hog there, which were also introduced by the conquistadors. And it's like, yeah, but guys, they've been there for 500, 600 years. I mean, at what point are you going to say that something is of the land? Because clearly this is a healthy ecology. And I think that's the point I'm trying to drive at here. When one looks at rangelands that have Mustangs on them in the USA, I wouldn't say that one sees unhealthy ecology, would you?
No. In fact, the horse is a great herbivore. It's like the bison was too.
Mm,
I think, the reason the horse evolved in North America, nobody argues that one.
yeah.
It's just, where did they go when they died out? Well, if you get a population that's under 100,000 in a continent like North America, and it moves into small places, small niched environments, the likelihood of discovering or finding those is almost zero. We just
Mm,
so, as they've dug up some of the trails and the Chinese artifacts going across Canada and down through
mm,
Colorado, I mean, uh, even those things are like, where did these gold pieces come from? There must have been some sort of a Chinese trail. When you look at the cartology of China and the fact that in, some of their dialogues, they were exchanging beadwork and horses, you know, pre-Columbian in the Northwest, and Equus tundra is very
mm,
Equus caballos, that it makes it seem like there probably were horses in the north then, and the pathways were open. You look at the Lakota beadwork, and it's like a Japanese or Asian empress beadwork, very similar. And so, rather than like you, I'm not, I mean, it's irrelevant at this point. If it's a good herbivore and it manages the habitat, then whether
Well,
it's
right. This is the
or
point.
not, yeah,
When it comes down to should we shoot Mustangs, I
yeah.
then go to team no, we shouldn't, because well, A, I like horses, but B, if they were there 40,000 years ago, and left, then they still are indigenous. And if they've been back for 600 years, and clearly the rangelands that they're on, unless there's massive overpopulation, are doing fine, then why do we need to persecute them? Yeah.
Well, that is a paradigm and an attitude. And you get back to your point, and I've read probably not nearly as much as you have on history and medieval, but it's set me on a path of discovery. And what I realize is when we write, you can write anything you want, and it doesn't all have to be truth. And when you look at ship logs and reading through that, I realized that sometimes they didn't tell the truth even in the ship's logs because they didn't want, they wouldn't continue their funding if they weren't in the right place. And so there's discrepancies all through history. And
Absolutely.
we take it at its face value, like this is written, therefore it's word. But in a lot of cases, I think it was written for a specific purpose and it may not be accurate. So, and we accept when you see something, I mean, in today's world, when you write it enough and you say it enough, we believe it. Does that mean it's the truth? Maybe on one level, in one dimension, but is it the truth of the time frame in the framework that we're discussing it? Maybe not.
Right. And it becomes it matters, I suppose, in inverted commas, when people are making decisions about whether they should persecute a species or not. And then every argument that one can muster to protect that species becomes relevant.
Well, and then you just said, we clump them together in species. We call humans a species, horses a species. But, my work looked at cultural diversity and functional social behavior. And I guess you could apply the same lens over humans and everything else. I mean, I'm all for getting rid of those in the societies. Let's move them out to the fringe if they're not supporting a sustainable, collaborative, forward-moving evolution. That's how nature has been so successful. And when we see these super competitive models that dominate, yeah, I mean, they're good for a while, but they all die out because there's nothing left. And so if we're managing towards sustainability and collaboration, then identifying those individuals in those cultures that have skill sets to be sustainable, I would think would be what we would try to manage toward, whether it's wildlife or social societies, which is a tricky one. We won't get into
It
that.
is indeed.
But
But so much of it comes down to, people's ideologies, doesn't it? I mean, I remember I was a journalist in the 90s when they did the first wolf reintroductions into Yellowstone.
oh yeah.
And I went up there, to report on that and interviewed, as like you, a bunch of ranchers who were really, really, of course, anti the wolf coming back. And I asked them, why? And they said, well, they'll kill everything. And I said, well, will they? And like, well, they'll kill some things. I said, well, that's probably true. And I said, it's also true that 100 years ago or 150 years ago, if you were trying to eke out a living here and wolves killed some of your livestock, that would probably impact you pretty hard economically. But we all know now that we're in a different economic time frame. And if they do kill some of your livestock, it's already been said that you'll be amply compensated. So what's the real problem? And every time when I stripped away the onion layers, the real problem was we just don't want to be interfered with by government. We just resent this interference, and we see now the wolf as a symbol of government coming and interfering. And I said, well, I can understand, but I also said, but you're also American, right? You believe in free enterprise. And they're like, well, yes, of course, and start waving the stars and stripes around. And I said, well, then what about wolf t-shirts and wolf mugs? And, if the wolf comes back, can you not make some money off these wolves? And then what if, they get a sustainable population? Can't you hunt them? Do you like hunting? Well, yeah, we do like hunting. So, well, then what if you did that? And what if you guided trophy hunters to hunt a certain number of these wolves once they've reached us? Isn't that kind of, you get your jollies, you get to kill them, you get to sell t-shirts, and the wolves get to be there too, and you also get to grumble about it because you love to grumble, and everyone happy, no? And of course the wolf is back, and so that outcome has sort of happened. But it's interesting how, I mean, you must have discussed, found this with the Mustangs, that it comes down so much to ideology, no? more
It
than
did. I
horizontal?
worked a lot with the ranchers, and I have to say, my experience with Wyoming ranchers was not what people's perceptions were. The ranchers,
Mm,
they don't want to risk their lives, their horses' lives. They don't want to waste energy. They're very sustainable in their systems because they've lived in the land for so long.
mm,
The good ranchers that I worked with and around Green Mountain and different places, they had a system and it was working very well for years. And I think you hit the point. They just didn't want interference. So Wyoming was very slow to meet the BLM's requirement of removing horses because they already had at that time in the 70s a rancher removal system, and it worked well. They'd stick a seasoned mare down the corral and wait for the bachelor boys, the bachelor bands to come down. And those are stallions that are running in a bachelor group and don't have harems. And they'd come down and then, they'd be in the corral and they'd be ranch horses so the next week. And the stallions that had mares and harems had very functional groups and they were together for years and years. And the migrations and where they went, the ranchers knew when they'd see them, when they wouldn't. And they left
mm,
them alone because the reproductive rates were quite low, 1 to 4%, 4%, 2%, depend on the year. But they didn't have any ingration and not much migration, a little bit of migration. But because we didn't have a lot of pressure from bachelor stallions trying to take over, only a really tough, smart stallion would even get in to get mares. And so when you looked at natural die-off and you looked at removal of most of the stallions that wanted mares, which were ranch horses, it was pretty managed. So the BLM came in and just decided to take a bunch and gate cut, and that's when reproductive rates just skyrocketed. They destroyed the social culture. And yes, people have this, I don't want to say mythology, but beliefs of the family bands, which in some groups were very strong and in other groups were very loose. The social society of horses, while it did not completely match with ecology. In other words, as a behavioral ecologist, we like to think that the land dictates the behavior of the species. And to a point, getting food and water, they're going to migrate to food and water. But the behaviors of the different cultures of horses were quite different. There was one herd that even another group of horses that could not understand them. They would come to the water hole and they would all just, up and down with their heads. And even the youngsters, the foals would go up and down with their heads. And I remember seeing another band look at them and just stare at them like, what are they saying? What are they doing? We don't understand you. Whether they did it and developed a behavior like this from flies or because of thirst, requesting who knows, but the entire group, they taught it. And since so much of social mammal behavior is learned, horses learn from us, they learn from other horses, and that's where we can't say horses are this way or horses are that way. You have to really look at the context of which you're making those statements. You can say loosely what things are, and but when you look at other researchers around the world, Dr. Dan Rubenstein, who did the intro on the wild horse part of my book, he's from Princeton, and he has studied equids all over the world, zebras, Przalski horses. And while we see similarities in terms of bachelors and stallions with harems and social facilitators of mares, there's unique cultures out there, and that they have decided to make a different decision and go a different direction. You see cross-species cultural groups where there was a bighorn sheep that decided to stay with first a bachelor group, and then he moved in when the bachelors got mares, and he never went back to being a bighorn sheep. He stayed with his bachelor horse friends. Well, they weren't bachelor anymore. They were stallion friends that had mares. And he was right up there with them, protecting the herd with some big horns. So, that to me is what amazed me about being in the field as a field biologist and spending so much time alone with, I have to say, no cell phones, not even a computer. So you're still taking notes. Probably you remember those days where you write notes in a notebook before you you can
yes,
talk
when I was daubing on the cave walls.
about that time.
Yeah.
So there's something different when you're making pictures and notes and, I did have a camera, so I could snap some, but mostly I realized it was my field notes that were most helpful because when I would try to bring a camera into the picture, whether it was with wild horses or then later in life I was doing dolphins and behaviors, there was a disconnect. And that's why I so admire photographers because they have to just sit there and be a part of the landscape for so long before they can really capture what's going on. Where I would be there and I would be watching and observing, And then I remember so many times I'd go to get my camera and that observation would disappear. I wouldn't be able to get it. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to even try to take a picture. And I think of all the times, the one picture I finally did get was actually of a badger. It was a young juvenile badger. And he kept going up and through the cattle guard with me. He'd come up and look at me, and then I'd go to get my camera, and then he'd go back to the other side of the cattle guard. And it was almost like a game. And I'm like, okay, no one's going to believe that we're playing this hide and seek game with a badger. And finally, I got my camera, and he sat up on the other side of the cattle guard just like this, and I caught his picture, and it's like, there. It was just the cutest thing. And it was just curiosity. And I noticed that wildlife behaved very differently, again, going back to my thesis, when you're looking with them, not at them. I had pronghorn antelope coming up behind me. I'm studying with binocs, pronghorn antelope out there, and feeling like Rupert Sheldrake actually wrote The Feeling of Being Looked At. He's written on that. And when you turn around and it's like a young buck with his head down, stiffing my camera gear and my backpack, and I'm like, I don't think you're supposed to be over here. I think your mom's going to wonder where you are. But that innocence of curiosity with no fear is what brought wildlife around. And so, getting back to the attitudes of what we read and what's written, I'm careful as a scientist, and I think this is a progression that perhaps other people have gone through too, is that you start out as a scientist and you honor science and you make things very, quote, objective, which in reality, they're not that objective. And then you start to be more subjective and put it into context. And then as you start to merge with nature, you start to become a naturalist. And then you get deeper into connecting with nature, and you start to become a spiritualist. And nature just draws you in because I think it feeds our souls the deeper we go and the more connections we have.
Well, right, it is our souls. We cannot, I find it very interesting when people talk about, the separation from nature, as if that were even possible. Here we are talking through Zoom, right? So there's silicon involved and there's electricity involved. And what are these but products of the universe, which is nature? And we both are breathing in oxygen, currently. And so even if we were sitting in the middle of some, highly artificial looking environment, hell, I've even got an AI background here.
Yeah.
But it's all nature. It's just processed by humans. But that's what we've always done as humans, ever since we first started messing about with fire. But it's still nature. And it's interesting to me that it's, again, ideology, that there's a concept that it's even possible to separate oneself from nature. But of course, we know what people mean. It's people taking a destructive attitude. And speaking of destructive attitudes, so why at the time that you were studying out there on the rangelands, why was the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, by the way, for the British and other non-American listeners and viewers, who are the people who manage the rangelands, the government agencies that run the big rangelands out in Western North America, in Western USA. Why did they take this approach? And then you also mentioned something about cross-fencing and gates, which disrupted the social...
Oh,
did I hear that correctly? And then numbers skyrocketed when actually numbers before that had been stable. So can you just clarify that? So why was that decision made? What was this change in policy? And also, what were you studying? Were you studying sort of, quote unquote, in defense of the Mustangs being there? Or at this stage, were you just purely objective?
Part of my undergraduate work at the University of Wyoming was doing a range comparative study in the 1973 through 76. And it was on 72, 73, 74, I guess is when it was. It was looking at dietary overlap of horses with cattle, sheep, elk, pronghorn. And actually, I never thought much about it. I turned in the research until I was on the National Advisory Board for the wild horses and burros of the United States in the early 90s. And I thought, it initially, which it was a National Academy of Sciences grant that was substantiated through the University of Wyoming, competitive diets that horses were competing with other livestock, which initiated the removal of wild horses. That's what it started with. So they passed the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act, which was due to Wild Horse Annie, because they were just, not all ranchers were good at the time. I gave you my window view of the Wyoming ranchers I worked with. But in Nevada and other places, it was quite cruel and they were doing horrible things to them. So that was the largest outcry to Congress outside of the Vietnam War, because children wrote into Congress, you can't do this to our horses. So it stopped. They had a National Protection Act. But what happened with that is that the land managers, and realized the Bureau of Land Management was never a wildlife manager. They were a land manager set up for railroads and, managing livestock. And so here they got thrown to manage wild horses. And in their mind, they're like, so now we got to manage a bunch of feral ranch horses. That was not it wasn't their fault. It wasn't their niche. And Fish and Wildlife didn't want it because you can't shoot it. And so if you can't shoot it and eat it, which I've been on record testifying on that one when I was on the National Advisory Board, making the statement that if you can't shoot it or eat it, it doesn't have a value. And that's when we get to what is the human value. So they started removing horses, and the ranchers got the finger pointed at them. So some were ranchers, but when you really dive into it, there's a lot of oil and gas leases. And, it's the whole Wild Horse and Burro program has been more about getting the public off public lands. The group of people that hunt and fish, and typically, again, I've known great hunters and good, people that are good about it. And I have made the comment, if you're going to remove horses, shooting horses on the range, like we would remove other wildlife species, may, in fact, in some cases, be the most humane way, as opposed to putting them through helicopter chases and separating them and then sending them in adoptions. And, the stress of separation and travel and doing all that, while we have some wonderful programs out there, in some cases with, again, identifying the cultural integrity and what those horses' stress level is, that should have been an option. But we tend to go over here and over there with fertility control, no fertility, going back to gate cut. There was no...
What's gate cut? That was the word that you used.
Yeah, it was gate cut. So in the early days, they just said, well, there's too many horses. So let's just say there are 2,000 horses on the Red Desert, and they want to bring it down to 500 horses. Now, recognize there was no range management studies done. There was no competition studies done. They were just simply going off the National Academy of Sciences study, which, as I started to say, I thought they must have had more work. And when I went in and looked at the research, it was my study. I was the field biologist doing the comparative data under, my maiden name, Canny. So I called the University of Wyoming, had them go back in the microfiche files and say, was there more studies in my range study at the time that showed dietary overlap? And Mike Smith was the head of range at the time, and he went back and said, no, it's Marianne Canny, your name's on here as a field student. And I said, could you please look at the summary? And he looked at the summary, and there were I think there were 14 sites. I can't remember now, but there were 4 of the 14, I think it was, that there was direct overlap with cattle. The rest had overlap with elk or pronghorn, something else. There really wasn't a huge overlap with cattle. So I asked him, I said, do you think that would lend itself to be significant overlap? And I'll never forget what he said. He said, even at the University of Wyoming, we don't statistically do it that way. That is not significant. So what happened is they basically made the data say what they wanted it to say to initiate the removals of horses. And what they did in the early days is they just run a bunch of horses in with a helicopter, or cowboys chasing them. And then when they had the first 100 horses, they just closed the gate and turned the rest back. And then they'd bring more in, close the gate, turn the rest back. Well, there was no study of the behavior of the groups. And my work on behavior and studying horses showed that very often you had a lead mare, often in the front, and she's taking the group forward. The stallion oftentimes was in the back, herding together. So what you did is you broke up a bonded pair with their group. So now you've got the lead mare trying to kill herself to get out, and you've got the stallion with not his favorite mare. And so that led to not having stable society in horses, because the social facilitator, being the mare, took over a lot of responsibility in terms of when we're moving and moving the foals and alertness. And so now you had young males not being raised by good mares or older mares, trying to breed 2-year-olds. And so we saw quite quickly, within 2 or 3 years, that the mares coming in foal went from an average of like the young mares back in the 70s was, 5, you'd see a 4-year-old, rarely would see a 3 or 2-year-old, but it went from your 4 and 5 and 6-year-olds to 2-year-olds were now in foal, which in a functional herd, they'd never even get to a 2-year-old. She'd still be with her mom, with her natal band. So that again is in Wyoming. Other areas had different behaviors, but there was no effort to try to manage by species, which we did in other wildlife. We would look at elk behavior. We would look at who we want to hunt, which ones you want to take out. You want to take out big ones or little ones, how many points, and there was a lot more wildlife study where the horse was not treated as wildlife. It was treated as just an excessive agricultural, as I won't use the term, but they used to call sheep in Wyoming range maggots. And I think that there was a lot of attitude that that's what the horses were, just something.
Well, no, I think you're right. I think that the Mustang thing seems to be divided into those who love them and those who hate them, and the ones who hate them seem to hate them with a peculiar passion.
Well, I can tell you why.
Regarding them as vermin, which is very, very strange to me, given.
Well, I have an answer for that.
Yeah.
I actually surveyed the ranchers in Nevada. There was a lot of killing of Mustangs going on at the time of wild horses. And I thought, this is what sent me off into graduate school to study consciousness, to be true. I watched a person testify at a local BLM meeting, and they were testifying quite nicely. And one of the BLM wild horse reps threw his briefcase at the guy, like threw it at him. I'm just like, oh my God, I've never seen that behavior before. And I thought, I am really not prepared to handle people here. I'm good with the wildlife. And so I thought, I need to go back to graduate school and understand humans. So part of what I was doing was interviewing ranchers and saying, why were you killing them? And I found it very interesting and to gain their understanding. And I'll never forget, one of the ranchers near Winnemucca, Nevada told me, he said, I'll tell you why I hate those horses. And I knew he had poison. This is many years ago, but he had poisoned some horses. And so there was a big, 60 minutes or whatever going on. And he said, I know those horses were here with my grandfather. I know some of his horses got out. I know those horses were kind of put here by us. And he said, I can't pay my mortgage. I'm struggling to keep my land. And he said, when that stallion comes down, the one and he says, he looks at me in the eye and he eats my alfalfa field. And he said, I'm jealous because he has freedom and I don't. And
that was very honest.
Really hit me. Yeah.
Why do you think he was so candid with you?
Well, he knew that I'm not a judgmental person. I was truly interested in understanding. I worked with ranchers on range management. I turned ranchers into ecotourism. And what you were talking about with, the wolves, this is back in the 70s and 80s. I would facilitate workshops between Audubon and ranchers, and I wouldn't let anybody say who they were from. You become friends, and then we come up with ideas. And so, when I kick to Finch Ranchers, you can get people from San Francisco to come out to your ranch and help you, and they'll pay you money. One rancher in southeastern Oregon, he sat there and he had also been killing horses on the Kiger Plateau. And his son one night came to my room. We were staying at the ranch and it was over near the Kiger Plateau. And the son came to my room and knocked on it. It was late, 10 o'clock at night. And I had just gone through driving home with this person who tried to run over rabbits. So you can imagine, it was just like,
people like that too.
Yes. Can you just stop this? Just humor me. Quit trying to hit every rabbit you go over. This is like, okay, and I have to stay. But it was part of trying to understand each other. So anyway, he came, knocked on my door, and I went out there, and he's having a hard time talking. And he said, I got to tell you something. I said, all right, I'm listening. Because I learned to have non-judgment. I learned to just have this blank face where you just go, okay, I hear you. I hear you. I don't agree with you, but I hear you. And he said, he had killed another group of horses along the desert below the Kiger Plateau there. And he said, but here's why I killed them. And I guess I could do a whole storybook of why ranchers killed horses.
You should. I think it would actually be really informative. As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad. And we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called Movement Method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored as I was by Dr. Grandin and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online movement method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens.
And he said, and he was crying at the time because I think he needed to let it out, and he didn't have anyone to really tell it to, because I had a different opinion. I'd been sort of, telling stories and letting him know. And he said, those horses, their manes and their tails, they were dragging. The tail was dragging on the ground, and they were skinny, and they were walking just like in a single file. And he said, they looked so pathetic and sad. I just thought they'll be better off dead. And I looked at him and I said, so are you telling me if you look like that, I should kill you and shoot you too? And he looked at me and he thought about it. And he said, so maybe I wouldn't do the same thing now. So he changed, and we turned that ranch into ecotourism of getting people. And so his father was the one when I said, those little stone cottages there, let's get them cleaned up, because everybody's up early, nursing cows, calves and things. And he was saying how hard it was to get help. And he was following what the USDA made them bring cattle in and vaccinate them. And I said, why don't you think about going to organic beef? And he goes, how do I do that? And so we had a long talk. Actually, I think they did National Geographic, had him on the cover of The Last Cowboy. This is many years ago, back in the 80s. But Ed and I talked, and I said, people will pay more for your beef. You don't have to bring them in and get them vaccinated all the time. You can let them rotate from your different pastures, so they don't need to be handled as much. You don't need to give them all the crap. And then you can harvest them a little earlier and sell them direct to organic beef, which he did do a production, which saved him a lot of time and a lot of money. Then we talked about redoing the little cabins, and he looked at me and he goes, okay, you're telling me, you couldn't believe it. She's like, you're telling me someone's going to pay me money to come out in the middle of nowhere, get up at 4:30 in the morning and go out and work hard all day and nurse cows and do this and do that. You're telling me that there's somebody stupid enough that they want to do that? And I said, Ed, listen to me. I'm going to tell you the life of the person who's going to do that. I said, he gets up at 4:30 in the morning, he goes to the gym, and at 6 o'clock he gets on a commute called BART, and he has to go into San Francisco and walk to his job, and noisy and busy, and he's working hard. And then if he's lucky, he gets 1 or 2 trains at 6 o'clock at night, maybe gets home at 7, has dinner, gets to say goodnight to his kids, goes to bed, and starts all over the next morning. And Ed looked at me and he goes, you mean people live like that? And I said, yeah. And those people are going to think they died and went to heaven to come out here and be able to get up in the morning and smell fresh air and go out and help be in nature. And so we converted his ranch. So
Here's 2 questions. One is, the Dude Ranch concept had been alive and well for, it started in the late 19th century. So ranchers have known for a long time that people from the city will come out and pay money to experience some form of ranch life. Why was this, so that's question number one, why was this news to these people, even though I'm not suggesting it was quite like a dude ranch, but nonetheless, they were familiar with the idea that people would value that way of life and want to come out and pay to
Well,
it was sort of no. But the second question, just quickly, is at what point did you go from scientist to activist? Because by this point, trying to convince people to go organic or turn their land over to ecotourism and therefore also help protect ecology while doing that, that's now moving into the activism range. So first, why were the ranchers surprised? And B, at what point and why did you become activist?
okay. Well, one, I think they were surprised because they don't have a very big, wide lens for their life. It's very narrow. You just don't have time to do much more than ranch. And I don't think that they thought a working ranch had much to do with a dude ranch. Those are people that, I mean, hunting parties and people, they don't have time to put unexperienced people on a horse to do anything. I mean, I go back to Wyoming, same thing. I mean, I was, still in college at the time, and one of my rancher friends was saying, I mean, we're talking like 1979. He was saying, God, I just don't know how it's getting so expensive to move our cattle from winter range to summer range. And I was still in the horse world at that point in time. And I said, oh, I bet if you put an ad in one of the horse magazines or the Denver Post, you get lots of people that would want to come up here for free. And they're equestrians. They ride. They'll bring their own horses. And again, he looked at me and goes, you got to be kidding me. And I said, just try it. You got nothing to lose. So they did. They put an ad. They had like 100 applicants of people that wanted to bring their horse up. And they started, years later, the movie City Slickers was made. But this was back reality of people that had a horse that said, oh my God, let's go herd cows in Wyoming. This sounds like fun. And they did. And they realized, and the funniest thing, this is the funny part, is years later, I was in Wyoming, I want to say 10 or 12 years later, and I looked up that rancher to see if they were still doing it. And he said, we don't even take our cows to market anymore. They know the way, so we just stick people, they can just take the horses, the cows know where they're going. The cows are the guides back and forth, and they made way more money. They went from providing food and not paying to getting paid from people that wanted to do it. So,
yeah, sure.
Okay, so second question, I don't consider it an activist. I consider it a solution finder. I'm a whole systems
That's the best kind of activist.
Yeah. So when I hear a problem and I listen to all sides, my brain thinks like nature. Where's the point in the system that if we made this change, it might sustain the whole system? And so ecotourism to me didn't even have a name at the time. To me, it was just a way to monetize a skill set that you're losing money on to get you to make money to do the right thing. And again, most of the ranchers I worked with, they wanted to do the right thing. In fact, another study I did on range analysis was, and again, getting more into the consciousness work, we used what's called the Daubenmeier plot. You throw this little rectangle thing out in the range and you look at the plants in it, you look at the condition, and you rate the range. Well, I did it that way on a transect, the way science does it, very accurate. And then I would interview the ranchers about what they thought, what condition they thought the range was in. Do they think it was in good condition, fair condition? What do they think next year is going to bring? And I found that the ranchers were more accurate than our scientific studies, which is not unusual because they're living with nature. So they know, when this happens and we get a late frost like this, it looks like it's going to be, a long cold winter. Or when we get this in the summer, we're going to have a drought this summer. So we're not going to use those pastures this summer. We'll wait till fall before we use them. They had an intuitive feel for how to move. They weren't just saying, well, let's put as many cows out there as we can, let them graze down.
Sure.
Certainly there were some, but the good ranchers, no, that's not how they did it. This is their livelihood. This is their land too. So I was looking for solutions, and ecotourism offered one.
Who were you working for at that point? So you've been an academic, you've gone on to grad school. By the time you're getting into the ecotourism thing, how are you making your daily bread? Are you making it from the ecotourism? Are you making it from something else? Why are you getting involved in this solution making thing? The time that you put into it, somehow you also have to pay the rent. So Talk to us about that. Yeah. What are you doing at that
That's an
point?
interesting, I've never been asked that question, but it's an interesting question. Well, first place, it's always been my passion to help. And so I was very fortunate that I married an engineer at University of California who supports my passion. And so he's allowed me to continue doing what I want to do, whether I get paid or not. And so when I was in an undergraduate work, I worked for Utah International, which then became BPT Mining and then GE Mining. I went to work for Atlantic Richfield in the early days in my undergraduate. And again, looking for solutions. When I started working with Atlantic Richfield, they thought I was a guy because there were no women.
What is Atlantic Richfield?
Atlantic Richfield, ARCO is a gas. It's a big oil and gas company.
So
Okay.
you were working for oil and gas companies
I was
and advising them on the management of their
of
rangelands.
everything. Yes.
Okay, got
And
it.
then I went to work as a reclamation specialist for a global oil and gas company. But I will tell you, I interviewed 82 some firms, and the ones that I selected were about four because they already had environmental quality departments in-house. They didn't need laws to tell them what to do. They wanted to do the right thing. And I
Okay.
always felt like if you work with good people who want to do the right thing, they can shine. And ARCO was one of them. They didn't know, like I said, I was a woman until they hired me. I lived out in Gillette, Wyoming by
So
myself.
Mary Ann doesn't give it away at all.
It was
I actually
MA.
thought you were a bloke until just now. Yeah.
Yeah. It was MA. They thought I was
Okay.
Mark Allen because that happened at University of Wyoming because my advisory professor did not let me take the internship that I wanted. And shall I say, it would be considered sexual harassment and he would have been fired in today's world. But back then, being the only female, I just sort of passed it on. And I said, you better put my name in for the next job. And he did, but he put MA because he knew they wanted a guy up in Gillette. But they got me. And so that was a little shocking. They hired me off my resume, not my name. But as it turned, it worked out because I came up with a proposal to reclaim after the, the coal mine. They hadn't done anything. That was going to cost them $2 million for just a revegetation test plot. And they had budgeted, I don't
So
know,
basically, you were the person who would show them how to,
how to
once
do
you've
it.
mined, put it
Yes,
back,
put it all back, right.
put the ecology back. That's a satisfying job to have.
It was because with ARCO, they had like budgeted, I don't know, 20,000 or 200,000, something minor. They thought it was going to be a little tiny vegetation test plant. And I come in with this huge $2 million. You're going to take the overburden here. You're going to put the plants here. And they're like, the vice president of coal had to fly up to meet with me. And then he found out I was a woman. And he's like, what do you think you're doing? And I said, I'll tell you what I'm doing. No one has written the Office of Surface Mining regulations because they don't know what will grow. And if you do it this way, you will write the regulations and you will get your permits. And he said, let's do it. And they did. And they did get the permits for the Black Thunder mine in Gillette, Wyoming. So I love looking back at all of the places where I've interceded, from Hanauma Bay in Hawaii, setting up a rest rotation system on the bay, just like we do in range management, to Black Thunder mine, and working with companies that went beyond what they had to do and did it right the first time. And that's where people don't realize that they can.
That is very encouraging to hear. You know, one tends to naturally think of oil and gas, big business, mineral extraction, etc., was always being with the devil unless a gun is to their head, and then to whatever degree. But of course, what is true is that, yes, a lot of mining activity, they do put the ecology back. It just isn't massively reported. And it's wonderful that you got to be one of those people helping that happen. How long did you do that for? And also, we've drifted a little bit from horses in your life, in your personal life. Did you then, as you were working, then just get horses back in your life? Did you
I
begin to
never
ride
did
again?
not have horses. I always
Sorry?
had horses. I never not had, I never
Okay,
did not. I was out on the range on my horse. And
got it.
that was actually where I proved, I want to say, proved my undergraduate research back in the beginnings is when I would go riding out on the transect on my horse, I would see all this wildlife, foxes and ground squirrels and badgers. And then I'd go out walking to look at the same thing and they weren't there.
Yeah.
And then I'd actually get on my horse again to go out and look. But as long as I was looking for it, I didn't have the same sighting index. And I thought, I can't fudge the science. I know it's there, but I'm not seeing it at this time. So I changed it all up and I thought, I'm going to just pretend I'm just going out for a ride today. I'm not going to look for anything, but I'll stop at the transects and record. Well, when I was just pretending I'm having fun and enjoying the day, I had foxes and badgers and red-tailed hawks and everything's crossing my path. And I realized what's different, my brain waves. I was not looking at, I'm looking with. I'm enjoying being part of nature. So I took that to the next step and, did a study where I kind of became a rock. I just sat there being a rock, thinking, I'm a rock, I'm a rock, I'm a rock. And a Richardson ground squirrel came up around me and was foraging and, and it sat up on my knee. And I'm just like, I'm really into rock. Like I'm a granite rock. I'm a granite rock in the range. But when it got up on my head and stood up, it was not even a tenth of a second. It was just a split second. I thought, where's the camera when you need it? And it went, and went running back into its hole. And I thought, the only thing that was different was my thoughts. And so I started training other wildlife biologist friends and hunters how to be a part of nature and how to work, and photographers and hunter guides. And so I had a lot of guys to test it with.
You said you started training them. This is informally, just friends of yours,
yeah, they were friends
by some organization to do this?
No. It was friends. I was still working on the data. And so I just had them, I said, okay, so can you just help me out here? Like one was elk hunting, for instance. I said, keep track of the elk you see when you're out fishing in August. And bow season hadn't even opened. So it wasn't like they were being hunted. And bow season opens before, gun season opens. And all my friends, hunter friends, would tell me, gosh, when I was out fly fishing on the Wise, I'd saw the elk, but I went out bow hunting and they're gone. And I'm thinking, okay, is it migration patterns? Is it this? So we ruled out variables, and come to find out, when they were bow hunting and thinking they were going fly fishing, the elk were still there. So they outthought them in their energy. And it's the same energy I talk about in the book, A Horse by Nature. Shift your energy. I have clients to this day that I've said, it's your energy the horse doesn't like. If you can't manage your energy, that horse isn't going to go forward. It will not go into the jumper ring with you. It does not like your energy. And yet I stick another person on who I know their energy is soft and supportive, and the horse goes right in.
It's very interesting. This is known in Africa. When you go on safari, if you go on horseback, the animals relate to your horse before they relate to you. They will smell your horse before they smell you. Your silhouette is very different. And also, as you say, you are involved in your horse. So you are paying attention to your horse. You're paying attention to the ground even more because you don't want your horse to fall over. You're paying attention to what's out there because it might eat your horse. And actually, I read that's a great quote from a North American nature writer too. Said the further you go up towards the Canadian border, the more things there are that will eat your horse. I was right about that. But it's very true in Africa. And what is true is that the wildlife tends to approach you. And I think this is true wherever one goes. And when horse training, when I'm advising people for dressage training, particularly when it's the upper movements, piaffe, passage, the changes, the pirouettes, the stuff that is looked on as being upper level for whatever reason, I'll often say, pretend you don't want it. Pretend you're just going to the bar to get a beer. Say that in your head as you go round. And what will probably happen is the horse will probably offer, because it's a natural behavior of the horse and you've actually set them up in the balance. Kind of, why wouldn't they? But if they feel that this is something that you are putting pressure on yourself to put pressure on them for, like many things in life that we put pressure on for, they become elusive. And why would it be any different here? How do I know this? Because I put a lot of pressure on and seen these things go away. And the moment I pretended not to, and it's funny, your thing about being a stone, it saved that exact thing saved my life one time. I was in Botswana and there was this big noise in the camp, lots of banging of pots, lots of shouting. I was like, oh, there's a snake in the camp. That's what they do, they bang the pots. It's probably in the kitchen. I wonder what snake it was. Probably a cobra, probably a mamba, up, just walking back towards the camp, curious. As I'm walking back towards the camp, this huge black mamba, about 10 feet long, comes shooting up the trail towards me. This is the only of the big poisonous snakes in Africa that's actually aggressive. And he's pissed off. He's being, and then it's coming right at me. And I'm like, I'm a tree. 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 It went over my foot.
Wow.
I managed not to cack my pants in that particular moment because I so did not want to be, a living, warm-blooded
So
organism.
I have a really warm tree. I have leaves. I have branches.
A lot of sass. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That took a lot of self-containment. Boy,
But
that's
it's interesting. No, everything you're saying there is absolutely true. And I'm always surprised with hunters, particularly, because when they don't know this, because good hunters know this absolutely. All good hunters from any culture know that to be in any way successful, you have to effectively become your prey. You have to love them. You have to have this really intimate and respectful relationship. But you actually have to have a sort of empathetic relationship, which goes over into shape-shifting. And being fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with San Bushman hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, I've seen that shape-shifting process happen in so many ways. And of course, without that, there is no survival. But it's not just survival, it's thriving, it's quality of life, because it's, as you say, it's a spiritual process. I'm always surprised when people are surprised by that. And particularly within the horse world, because we have these really intimate relationships with our horses. We live with them, they're family to us, even if we aren't lucky enough to keep them on our property and we have to keep them at a boarding barn because we live in a city or something. We have so much love for this animal. It surprises me sometimes that the empathetic crossover, interspecies crossover thing doesn't come more naturally, despite we want to say, oh yeah, okay, I understand it's the Judeo-Christian, break with the blood. Yes, yes, yes. And we burned all the wise women and called them witches. Yes, yes, yes. And we went through all that history. Yes, yes. However, when you've got a horse in your life, or a dog in your life, or a cat in your life, or whatever, that's really in your life, that whole process just takes care of itself, because that's nature. And yet we go into barns and we see people struggling and separated and suffering from separation from their horses, and the horses suffering. Very similar to that story you told a little while back of the trainer who hit the horse between the ears, and you said, as a child, instinctively, why would you hit a horse in the head that had a headache? And the guy didn't know, but also wasn't curious enough to ask, and then was shocked and actually probably quite shamed, and probably asked himself, actually, why didn't I? So let's talk about this process of consciousness and intraspecies interaction and relationship.
way more fun.
You've spent a lifetime, even though you're only 28, looking at how species and land relate to each other. Where do you think the separation comes from, even when people actually are in deep relationship with other species?
Well, I'd love to blame Descartes, but I don't think we can. I think it is a puzzling curiosity in my head, and continues to be, how other species can learn collaboration and empathetic connection and communication, and humans just have such a hard time doing it.
And yet, the original blueprint, we are absolutely
We're
like
wired
that.
for it.
Gatherers,
Absolutely
we are
wired.
absolutely like that.
We are. And when you look at even why we have horses in our lives, okay, again, you write it down enough times, people believe it. And that's what's happened with horse training. You've probably seen it. If enough people say you must do this to get the horse to be engaged, let's go back to piaffe and passage. You must do it this way, and this is how you do it. I don't know. I'm not a dressage rider per se, but I can get a horse that's a dressage horse to do piaffe and passage, but it's because it's a joyful movement. It's joyful energy. It's yellow coming up through the bottoms of your feet. It's getting
Sure, it's what they do when they play. Yeah.
It's what they do when they play. Yes. So it should be fun. And, in teaching and training horses, the best time to get it is when they want to come home from a long trail ride and, their friends are ahead of them. It's like, go ahead, get a friend. And now you've got all this energy underneath you. It's like, now let's do piaffe and passage all the way home. So it's finding those moments where they would naturally use it and then putting it together. And so I think there is a check valve on our human emotions. And I think part of it is for safety. We don't want to get hurt, so we don't want to open up too much to other life, because it is, you can get
the fear of loss.
Yeah, the compassion fatigue. When you love things and they're going to die and they're going to be destroyed and you can't do anything about that compassion fatigue. I think that's part of it. But I can say that just, looking and working within the sport horse industry, if we keep sport horses, and I'm asking that as a question because the public is judging whether horses should be raced, whether they should be doing these things. I happen to know horses that enjoy it and like it. Does every horse enjoy it and like it? No. Just like every kid doesn't like to go to school or be told they have to do it a certain way. But those that do, simple ways to enhance the whole barn, and the trainers even had trouble doing this, but the ones that have gone, why didn't I remember that? I take them back. We do a kind of a guided visualization when you were a little kid and you loved horses, and you could hardly wait to get to the barn to go in the stall and say hi to the horses, and they were all over you. What's changed? And why are you not doing that every morning? And when they have done that, it doesn't take long. Go in for 15 seconds, give a buddy scratch, say, how are you doing? How was last night? Go to the next horse. Do the same thing. When you walk into your barn and you visit every horse in their stall, give them a nice scratch, reconnect, say, how was your night? Suddenly you have every horse sticking their head out going, where's my friend? Where's my friend? And it's because of that empathy. They're emotionally intelligent creatures. They're not intellectually intelligent. And we too are emotionals. And this is where I get so annoyed at, the models out there of prey predator, and they need to be told what to do, and they need this and they need that. Certainly they need some guidance, and you need to understand their behavior and what they're saying. But even within that context, horses communicate differently because of what they've learned. But they need the emotional context. And those that are the most, quote, aggressive are typically the ones that have no ideas how to make friends with horses or humans.
No,
And you
absolutely.
show them that, they soften.
Something that I think that the word that came up as you were talking just there is bitterness. This is something which is interesting within the horse world. It's a bitter world. It's contentious. It's fractious. For example, I said I'm going to get jumped all over for saying I'm on team. Probably horses weren't in the Americas before Columbus, outside of the 40,000 years ago thing, and I know there's going to be people who go, like, it's going to spark anger.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why? It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter. Or, we know, look at social media in the horse world. And yet, as you say, what motivated everybody to get involved with horses was love.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a desire for healing. Perhaps they were hurt. Many of us came to horses that way, but the purity of our love for horses was also its own thing. And where did that go bitter to the point where we then have to begin to attack our fellow humans? One of the things which worries me sometimes when I'm clinicking or teaching is I'll sometimes hear, it's a cliche statement. I hate people, but I love horses, or I hate people, but I love dogs. I'm like, well, then why are we here? Because this is people interacting with horses, and that involves people. And horses have always been domesticated by tribes of people on the steppes, whether they're the North American steppes or the Eurasian steppes.
Yeah.
And these are groups of people and horses interacting, and horses want to interact with people. Do you think that they want to interact with a bitter person who's bitter towards their fellow species? Would we want to interact with a horse that's bitter towards other horses? That's problematic. Do we think that a horse doesn't notice? Do we think a horse doesn't feel some distress if we go around with this bitterness? And yet, even I have felt it in myself, in previous iterations of myself. I have to admit that I've been a little bit that person. Why was I that person? Because I heard other people being that person, and I wanted a sense of belonging. So I joined that negative, dysfunctional tribe for a while. Didn't like it, so I didn't want to stick around very long. But I do empathize with why, people get there, and the sense of loss. But I might lose this. I will outlive my horse or whatever. But yet, it is a weird paradox, isn't it, Marianne, that this thing that should be the biggest source of happiness in our lives, we are the top 1.1% of the population if we get to hang out with ponies in our lives. And yet, here we are going around being bitter.
Well,
What's going on? Yeah.
I think, again, it gets down to trusting your intuition and developing it. And most people, either don't know they have it or they don't trust it, and they've been taught against it. I guess I was one of those kids that try as my parents might to say it one way, I went, no, I'm right. And so rather than going along with the system, I just figured everybody else was wrong and I'm right because my world worked for me. I was happy in my world. And it took a long time to get enough science and degrees behind me that I could take the criticism, giving lectures and papers. I mean, I did citation work. And I remember being accused by the academic world saying, well, Miss Simonds, that's really anthropomorphic of you to say that. And I said, no, it's very arrogantly zoanthropomorphic of us to think we had emotions before animals. And I'm like, where did that come from? And now I see the word zoanthropomorphic in quotes, but I used it back in the early 80s at a conference, thinking that it is our human arrogance that says animals are beneath us, and they're not. Nothing's beneath us. The plant, this is going along with what you said. If you love dogs and hate fleas, that doesn't work. You have to love life, and that's how we're going to learn to work with it. We're going to continue having hurricanes and weather events because we're so separate. And the minute we start realizing we can be water, we can be air, we can be horses, we can be snakes, we'll start to soften and open up our awareness and our intuition. And that's for a whole nother talk. But going back to just horses, I think that people have been wired to think that horses are a certain way and they have to behave a certain way. And I run into a lot of people that have been through various forms of, natural horsemanship and doing this and doing that. And I'm like, why are you doing that? Your horse obviously says don't. You put the carrot stick, it's like stomps its legs. Stop that. Don't do that to me. Why are you doing something that your horse says no to? Listen to your horse. And, when I do a clinic too, and you're probably like this, I tell people, take what works for you, but don't do everything I tell you. I'm trying to give you tools to use with your own
Yeah,
personal.
exactly. Yeah.
And when you get back to loving, one of the gals, like years ago, again, lecturing at UC Davis in the vet school, and I asked, how many of you want to be vets? And it was kind of the time when women were starting to be more dominant than men. And I'd say about half raised their hands. And I said, how many of you, they all want to be vets, sorry. And I said, how many of you love animals, love horses? And only about half raised their hands. And I said, why aren't all of you loving horses and want to be healers? What's wrong here? And you could see them get very uncomfortable. And after the lecture, one gal came up to me. She was so angry and she was about ready to burst into tears and angry. And she yells at me and she said, I tried twice. This is my second, 2 or 3 times to get into vet school. I finally get into vet school and you just tried to tear it down. I said, what do you mean? And she said, we're not supposed to love animals. We can't get through these classes if we love animals. And I said, yes, you can. And if you don't love animals, you shouldn't be in this school. You are the students paying to go here. You tell them what you want. And if you're doing something that makes you feel wrong about the animal, then you can communicate that. Obviously, I didn't have tenure, so it wasn't an issue, but it was like this feeling that you can't love an animal and also heal it and be in science. How can you not love nature if you're studying it? How can you not love it? Well, that's a question. And you get into the animal assisted therapy field, and that has become a topic of discussion of compassion fatigue. If you're working with animals and you love them, and here's a question that was asked years ago at the Institute of Animal Assisted Therapy that gets along with your thinking. If you love animals and you're working in animal research, is it better to have someone who loves those animals be taking care of them, or better to have someone who doesn't care taking care of them? Because they're all going to be euthanized. It's a tough one. We all came up with, we're all going to have compassion fatigue and we're going to be the ones taking care of them and euthanizing them in peace and love, because having someone who does not care about an animal in animal research, that's why, not to get off subject too much, but chicken farms and anything we use the word slaughter, why are we still using that word? That implies torture. Why not euthanasia, happy euthanasia? Why are we not shifting our language to make death a more enjoyable process, or at least not a fearful process? And we don't want to get humanly vulnerable in our emotions.
Well, yeah, we in our culture, death is de facto negative. So we have trouble envisaging it any other way. Lots of things came up from what you just said there. The first one was, to say that to the vet getting in there, is to say, well, then, frankly, why aren't you at law school? I mean,
Yeah.
why are you here doing this vocation that is passion driven? Because, okay, you might make a living as a vet, but you're not in it for the money. So why bother? if you don't love them, why not just do something else? That's interesting. The second thing that comes up there for me is the thing of euthanasia. This is the dirty, not secret, it's in plain view, but it's not something any of us really want to address. We are all going to euthanize
Yeah.
our animals.
Yeah.
If we are lucky, I'm just talking from the human experience, the horse owner experience, or the dog owner experience, lucky, you don't have to make that decision. You go out one day and hopefully your horse is very old and very happy, and he's just been standing there dreaming for a while, and you come out one day and they're just lying down and they're not there anymore. That's happened to me with all the horses that I've owned, I think maybe 3 times or 4 times. And each time I'm like, this is a blessing.
Yeah.
But all the other times I've had to make the decision. And sometimes I've made the decision right, and sometimes I made the decision wrong. Betsy, the horse that, was my son became verbal on, when she became so old she couldn't digest her food anymore, I couldn't bring myself it was a human thing. It wasn't a horse welfare thing. It was a human thing. I could not bring myself to pull the trigger. And so she ended up suffering, I think, a bit, whereas I should have, in retrospect, made that wolf decision within the ecosystem earlier. But I still made it. Then I had another horse. I think I made it right where I made it early. He was one of the most crazy sway-backed horses I've ever seen. We got him as a donation horse. Nobody wanted him, obviously. Turned out actually to have a relatively strong back, but we knew that a day would come when it failed him. And so he was also this in-hand schoolmaster. He did all the airs above the ground. He
Wow.
loved it. And every time I tried to retire him, he'd just be like at the gate going, what am I, chopped liver? Come on, we want to do stuff. And then one day he was rolling and he couldn't get up. And I was like, this is happening. And he struggled and he struggled and he struggled, and we sat with him. He eventually got up. And we're like, should we, shouldn't we? I'm like, I'm going to go traveling. He's going to go down. No one will be here. We're lucky we saw this time. He doesn't deserve that. Let's end it now. But was it the right decision? And then another time, this is way back, this is like 25, 30 years ago, probably more now. It was a woman, I was eventing riding for a woman outside of London. And she had this horse who was one of these archangel horses, that wins everything when it goes in, but is also like the total family horse, went international in its competition, but you could put like someone who couldn't ride at all, and he just take him around the farm, like total gentleman all the time. Amazing horse. Got a sudden weird kidney failure. And anyway, a decision was made to put the horse down. And the vet said, there's nothing more I can do. I can't get to the bottom of this. I suggest you look for a faith healer. And this was before my whole journey into shamanism and time with indigenous cultures and so on had started. So I was like, oh, gosh, well, what's that? And how would one even find that? So
Your
we
vet
asked
said
around.
that?
Sorry, the vet said that.
That said, wow.
Outside
Progressive,
London said that in the early 90s. And so we tried. We looked around, couldn't find anyone. Anyway, I was the one who had to bring the horse down to be put down. And he was just a skeleton. And this happened. He went from like top condition to a skeleton really quick. And you know how when horses are really sick, or animals are really sick, or people are really sick, and they want to go. He did not want to go. He did not want to go. Well, we shot him. 2 weeks later, I'm in a party, drinks party in London, media types. I'm talking to this woman. She's a producer, TV. I said, oh, what are you doing? Oh, we did this series on animal faith healers. I'm like, where were you 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
So I said, did you meet anyone that you thought was the real deal? And she said, actually, there was one person. The rest we thought were actually sort of attention seekers. But there was this one guy, funny little guy, who lived in a trailer outside of London, and vets refer people to him. And he did one of the Queen's horses who had a lymphoma, a brood mare, and then she went on and da-da-da-da-da. And I said, put me in touch with this man. So I followed him as a journalist for 2 years
Oh,
and
nice.
recorded all these miraculous things he did. And all he would do was go and spend a bit of time with the horse and then come out and give some instructions. And the instructions were always really banal, like change the water at 3 o'clock tomorrow, put the rug on at 5 o'clock, and then tomorrow, the day after that, change the water at 2 o'clock and put the rug on at 4. It was like that banal.
Wow.
And I was like, Charles, his name was Charles, said, well, what's going on? And he said, if I tell you, you'll think I'm crazy. So I said, well, it's pretty crazy anyway, so go on. So he said, I used to have a friend who was a vet called Buster Lloyd Jones, who was in a wheelchair. And he and I used to show dogs together and sometimes would co-own a part of a racehorse together. And he died 18 years after his death. 18 years after his death. I was in a stable with a horse that had an injury. I was part of a syndicate that owned this racehorse. And everyone, we're talking about putting it down, everyone went out of the stable. I'm standing there alone. Buster Lloyd Jones appears to me in his wheelchair 18 years randomly after dying and says, you're going to be my hands.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Rupert? And I said, well, I think that's completely nuts. And he said, well, you did ask.
Yeah.
So, but this is getting to fields of consciousness, right? So,
And that's
yeah. As you may know, if you've been following my work, we are also horsey folk here. And we have been training horses for many, many years in the manner of the old classical dressage masters. This is something which is often very confusing for people. We shine a light on that murky, difficult stuff and make it crystal clear. If you'd like to learn to train your horse in the manner of the old masters and really have fun and joy for you and your equine, go to our website, heliosharmony.com, sign up as a premium member and begin to take the Helios Harmony course, which will take you from zero to the piaffe, where the horse is dancing on the spot, in hand, on the ground. And then from there, you can develop out to anywhere you want to. heliosharmony.com to unlock the secrets of the old masters.
I was going to just pick up on that. I mean, going back to when I was 11 and my passion, I mean, yes, I was a scientist. On the outside, it looked like I was a good scientist doing all this data, but on the inside, I was cheating in a way because I could communicate with nature and animals. And so I knew the outcome before I designed the study. So I was, and I think a lot of scientists
Inside trading.
Yeah, it was designing the study with the hypothesis I already knew the answer to. So it just became so much easier. And this actually played out many times through my years of saying, oh, well, the plants are uptaking water. And they're like, how do you know that? And I'm like, well, you do. And then the lab has to develop a transpirometer to see if it is uptaking water for oil shale. And yes, it was. And then having them all come back and go, how did you know that? So teaching how we know what we know and how to communicate. Now we're moving into quantum fields and, entanglement theory and other things, but it's not as difficult as you think when you have a quiet mind. And I think, if you meditate and if you trust your intuition, you trust when those little voices come in. And so having taught interspecies communication for, 40 years and looking at other people that have done it, like, I've told this story in the book too about the cowboy who, his horse was all sweaty and he asked me to go out on the range with him and count dry cows when I got to school. And I said, okay. And he shows up with a pickup truck and no horse trailer. And I'm like, where's your horse trailer? And he's like, oh, I thought you told me you had a jumping horse, because I had a jumper from California. And then he whistles and his horse comes in out of pasture and it's all sweaty and messed up. And I said, don't you wash your horses after you're done? I'm in California, I'm 18. We clean our horses. And he looked at me and he was so puzzled again. And he's like, well, if you just worked 16 hours and were all sweaty and hot, would you want to be messed with or go out and roll in the dirt and eat with your friends? I'm like, good point number 2. Anyway, he kept this up. Then he finally cleaned him off, put him in, whistled. The horse jumps in back of the pickup truck with his dog. And I go, how'd you teach him that? And he is looking at me so puzzled, like he's as puzzled by me as I am by him. And he goes, I didn't. He just wants to go to work with me. And that moment I knew he had what I had. He didn't know he had it. I'm going to study what he has. And I'm going to start to see what are the similarities. And that's when I developed like the techniques, which I've put in the book, like offer techniques, being open, friendly, focused, empathetic, respectful, how to evaluate the psych, the energy exchange, slowing your brain waves down, multiple channels to get yourself into the channel of communication where you can hear and send thoughts, feelings, smell, because it is a brain exercise. And with all of the distractions we have, it's hard for people to hear things because we have so much chatter everywhere. And so teaching communication, I think that's one of the things the horses can do. And, having, worked with autistic folks early on, I realized autistic children knew how to focus like the horse does. They knew how to sense all the sensory experiences that a horse has, the loud noises, the smells, and the horse has to filter all that through for us to be with us. And so I actually used studies from autism on what's called shared awareness, where you're not sure how you're communicating, but you are communicating. And the early work back in the 70s that was the term we used, shared awareness. You knew you were communicating. And that model of working in the 70s and 80s with how psychologists were working in trying to understand autism, and you probably have more input on this too. That model worked very well in trying to teach people how to relate to horses. And to this day, I can teach all the techniques, but the simplest one I say that gets people into their emotional part is pretend that horse is a 4-year-old little autistic brother, and you treat him like that. And then their energy shifts. They're kind, they're soft, they're supportive, they're aware of what that horse is going through, and suddenly the horse walks in the ring with them. So it's getting us into the part of the brain where we can slow down, process all this stimulus, filter out what's the information we need. And oftentimes when we ask a question, I think the biggest thing is people don't believe they can do it. But when you have, I used to have groups and I'd have them all ask the same horse the same question independently, and then I'd bring them back. And oftentimes there were some people that didn't get anything because they didn't trust, but people would be in the same ballpark. Like they say, well, the horse is lonely. And then the next person would say, the horse is lonely because its friends went to a horse show. Next person says, well, the horse is upset because his friends are all gone and his water doesn't work. So they were getting way more information, some people, without even knowing they were getting that kind of information. So studying how people process that information, how do they get the knowledge that I can get, and then teaching it. So I've taught, for a number of years at the Nippon Animal Science University, the vets, the graduate vet students, on how to do interspecies communication. And then the vets were teaching it to their students.
Which animal science university?
Nippon Animal
Where's
Science
that?
and Tokyo.
Okay, that's what I was going to
Yes,
assume.
Tokyo.
How
And
did you end up working there?
I was doing a flower essence conference in Scotland at Findhorn on flower essences for animals, and met a cardiologist that was head of the vet school, amazing man, Mac, at that conference. And we started sending flower essences through the internet. And then he had me come over and start doing training. And then I trained his wife. And then they started sending students over to my ranch. And so I started getting a whole lot of students I could train to be teaching it. So they actually went on to teach at international vet conferences, the model, because they needed to validate. And Japanese are so connected. Like all the exercises I would give them, they would just like all be finished. I'm like, how did you do that so fast? They'd think a thought, they all knew what it was. I go, okay, think of an animal, we're going to act it out. And they're like, no, we're done. I'm like, how can you be done? Well, and they'd go through and they all got, as soon as one person would think a deer, and another person would think a rabbit, they go rabbit. They like reading each other's thoughts all the time because they were in that quieter inner space, even though there's a lot. They've learned how to filter what's out here away so they can stay in their own little space. And I found that very interesting. So I've made it my life. I mean, that's why, I put together Horse by Nature and gave so much on communication, is that there's no one way to do it, but pick a channel, pick a model, pick something and start practicing it so that you can trust yourself when someone says, you need to take that whip and hit that horse and, take that crop and make him go in. And your voice quickly goes, no, don't hit me. You know where that comes from. It's not projection. And that means you need to be clear. Or a horse says, don't touch me right now. I'm going to bite you. You know that. And you know that the horse is talking to you. And then you
Yeah.
can ask questions. And so, yeah, the whole communication and consciousness. And that's where, sending at no distance, moving your energy into the horse, feeling it, moving it out so you can sense what the horse is feeling, all kinds of things. That would be a whole nother talk.
Devil's advocate question, because obviously you're preaching to the converted, and obviously I'm the sort of bloke who rides across Mongolia from shaman to shaman with my autistic kids. So let's assume I'm a friend of the woo. However, one of there are extremes. We talked about bitterness, but the Western mind tends to work in extremes. So either the problem is force, coercion, whether with a horse, whether an autistic kid, whatever, or the absolute opposite, to the point where there's a vacuum and no leadership. So one of the difficulties for me is I sort of tread the line between, let's get things done here, and let's absolutely also communicate cross species, cross more than across species, cross plant, cross stone, cross jellyfish, cross, yes, yes, yes. And at the same time, let's work together to do a job. So this sometimes can lead to an uncomfortable, paradoxical position where people from the best of motives, from very, very good reasons, then become so scared they won't even touch their horse or, offer leadership of any kind, and feel that they don't have the right to, or that they can't. And then the horse is like, well, why are we here? What am I doing with you? And I was giving a demo last year at a thing in Montana, and it came up that somebody said, well, I feel, Rupert, that when you were demonstrating these patterns on the ground, which are the basis of the old masters classical system, you didn't really ask the horse, you just kind of went in and did them. And I said, oh, well, that's because you had your eye on that other exhibitor over there who was doing their thing. So obviously you were looking at that person. What you didn't see was the 20 minutes that I was spending with this horse that I've just getting to know. And that involved just being together, that involved standing together, that involved finding the scratchy spot, that involved chatting, that involved. But I said, you know what it also involves is a lot of prayer. And it's just that the prayers, I'm doing them silently, because if I was to do them out loud, they take a long time and they would get in the way of that other person's thing over there. But believe me, that's going on. Why are you assuming that that's not going on? And then they said, well, she swished her tail while you were asking. I said, well, don't you ever swish your tail a bit? I mean, are you, A, there were flies around, but B, are you not sometimes a little annoyed? Or are you not sometimes a little effortful and you kind of stick your tongue out or frown or something, or while you figure something out? Or is that stress, or is that effort? And is all stress bad? I mean, when I'm figuring out how to start my Zoom call, because I'm Cro-Magnon, I'm finding I'm going through a little bit of stress, but the dopamine payoff is huge because I get to talk to Ann Simonds. So you don't think that the horse is enjoying this process of discovery that involves some effort? What about when they have to go and find water and it's an effort? Or what about when they get grumpy with each other? Or what about when you get grumpy with your fellow human? Is that the end of the world? Or, why are we thinking in these extremes? And then the following day, I thought, well, gosh, if that's what people want to hear, I'm going to tell them the exact prayers I'm doing. So before I did my demo, I said, look, yesterday somebody said this. So here's actually what's going on internally. And I invoked all my ancestors and I prayed to all the different gods and goddesses of the horse, and to Jesus, and to the Buddha, and to the planet, and to, I said, this is what's going on, but it's an internal process.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm asking the horse for permission, but the horse can't sort of send me an email, 3-page triplicate document signed by their lawyer, you know. So we do have to take some things on intuition and trust. So what the horse world is swinging between these two extremes of force and coercion, as one might see in the worst of, say, sport riding, because there's also a lot of good stuff in sport riding. It's getting a very bad rap right now. It's not all the devil, but there is some devil in it, yeah. to this kind of absolute extremist, almost sort of fundamentalist approach out on the other side. And I'm not sure horses want to be involved with that kind of extreme monkeydom, do they? I mean, do they not just
Well,
buddy up and hop in the pickup truck with your rancher friend and go to work?
again, it's very easy to categorize all horses, all humans, and I can
Mm.
tell you every horse is different. There are basic innate behaviors that are within every horse, but how they utilize and their communication skills, so much of their behavior is learned. It has astonished me that when people buy a horse, they don't even want to know where it came from, its history, how was it raised? Was it raised with its mother, other foals? None of this. And all that history, that's when the horse, 0 to 2 is when a horse learns what the world is like.
Absolutely.
And the feeling of the welfare that's finally getting into the sport horse world. But I had wild horses and I've had domestic horses. And I had wild horses. My wild horses were specifically picked to do a study on. And I can tell you, one of the two of the wild horses would prefer to stay in their stalls rather than their paddocks or their pasture. And they would make my poor thoroughbred have to go outside and stand guard so they could be all cozy and comfy. I would play music for them. One mare loved it. She'd come in with the music. The other one left. She didn't like it at all. So, watching the individualism from the same herd of two mares, same age, different mothers, but the differences that they had, the choices that they make. And I think that's the key, is giving a horse some choice. And while to say that a horse does not have fun, there are horses that will race each other out there. And I mean, I remember being years ago at a sports conference. It's the Association of Equine Sports Medicine, which is no longer, but the science and Tufts was going up through all the stuff they do to look whether a horse can run and how they're going to be in their heart. And some old breeder stood up and he goes, I just thought you'd watch the foals out there racing each other, matching each other up the hill. You could tell who's going to want to run because they would pace each other and one would just take off. And, it was a mental thing. So some horses love to run, but others don't. It's like saying they all need outside time of at least 3 hours. Yeah, tell the mare in the barn that kicks the fence down and flipped over trying to get out of her paddock to come back to her stall that. You're supposed to stay out for 3 hours now. She's like, I don't want to stay out. I don't like the bugs out here. And so we have to be mindful that every horse is different and have sort of our open checklist to feel stress is not a bad thing. We don't evolve without some stress.
No, absolutely. We need variability.
Yes, yes. So horses do like to work. Some of them are workers. And in the book, I go through personalities of horses. So if you're a worker, get a horse that has a work ethic personality. If you're I want to ride 2 or 3 times a week, I'm kind of lazy, I don't want a horse that's going to get too wild, get the beach boy mentality horse, that's just kind of hangs out and is happy socializing or going on trail. Horses have different personalities and they don't all fit into their friends group either. So there are horses that would rather be with their human friends because they're better and more adapted than their horse friends, which beat them up.
Yeah. It's interesting though, isn't it, how frequently people choose the exact opposite of themselves in horses. The person who only wants to ride once or twice a week picks the most fieriest thoroughbred Anglo-Arab they can. Or it's just we see this all the time. But of course, I guess we see this in human relationships as well. To some degree, we often pick our opposites. I guess that's the universe at work and God's sense of humor. In your book, then, given that, yes, of course, all horses are individuals, all humans are individuals, and all horse-human combos are individual, your book, Horse by Nature, you're offering people a set of tools for how to best communicate based on all this knowledge you have with wild horses and with domestic horses. Give us the skinny, give us the 101, the basic toolkit with the caveat that yes, this can be adapted. Yes, this isn't dogma. But nonetheless, what's the basic toolkit?
Well, the book, I think the way to give a 360 view is I didn't want to write another book. And I surveyed the industry and surveyed people. And what I got was people wanted a tip book, simple little tip book. So I told Trafalgar that, okay, I'll just do a little simple tip book. Well, the simple tip book turned out to be one of the largest books they've ever published. It's like 450 pages. but I did it in a way you can just pick it up and open it. So the first section is all wild horses and functional social behavior, how they communicate, how they function out there, so that you understand, like the National Geographic version of the horse without humans. It's horses without humans. The second section is horses with humans, how we can help your horse be more functional as a horse, because we assume the horse knows it's a horse and it knows how to act, and they don't. Some of these horses have no self-identity. They don't know what they are. They haven't been around enough functional horses to know they're a horse or how to act. So we have to teach them. And if you teach a horse how to greet, how to make eye contact, how to do a nose bump, how to do a buddy scratch, they suddenly are your best friend, because they're like, oh my gosh, now I know why I've been so nervous. They don't self-analyze, but they like start to relax because now they know how to make friends. But they didn't know they were supposed to do that. They learned not to look at people, not to touch people. So helping a horse learn how to be a horse is first, and be functional as a horse, and learn how to communicate. And then the last section is on welfare, ethics, and where do we go from here? Because I think the horse's role in society is changing and it has to evolve. Part of it's the social pressure of, social licensing. Are we going to be able to compete? Ideally, hopefully we'll compete only with horses that are enjoying it and having fun, but we're a long way away from determining that yet. We can't agree on what welfare standards are. And so I think our best tools are learning to develop yourself as a clear assessment of who am I and what do I want, and am I pure in my thinking and my thoughts, and without judgment, so that I can get to know another species and ask the right questions of who are you, and I'll help teach you how to be a functional horse, and I'll be a functional human, and we'll open up the communication channels, and you'll be able to talk to me. And horses are so readily eager to talk when you do that for them. And people so misunderstand them that the book has red tips, blue tips, green tips. And the red tips are, you really need to know these. If you don't want to do anything but go through and just read the red tips, you'll know a lot about horses. I want safety, I want comfort. That's what a horse thinks about. And where do I get safety and comfort? Not from food and water as much. I get it from my friends. But if I don't have friends, then I go back to the space, because that's what my association, because they're associative learners. So if the space is safety and comfort, then I'll bond to a space. If you're safety and comfort, think about it. If you, the human, are the safety and comfort, you're the safe space, horse runs to you. And people are always surprised when they get to that relationship, and they're like, I never thought my horse would do that. But my horse didn't want to run off with the other horses. It stayed with me, because they built what you were talking about. You spent time preparing, getting to know the horse, doing prayers, connecting. And when you spend that time connecting emotionally with the horse, helping the horse be a better horse as a horse, just spending time doing horse time, that horse wants you. And that's where people have lost that ability to spend horse time, that we love horses. Instead, they always have to be doing something for us. And if we can learn how to develop the relationship and communicate first, and I've done it in the book. There's pictures. So if you don't like to read, there's plenty of pictures with subtitles. There's research, so you can scan QR codes and get the research if you don't believe me, because we are evolving a lot of tools to assess horses. But in a nutshell, the best tool we have is be the best human you can be. You don't have to know everything. You just have to be clear on yourself and be pure and be silent, and then help your horse be the best horse it can be. And you talk about stress, it's really having boundaries and clarity, so the horse knows how to relate to you. And if you don't know my space, your space, how to stay out of my space, and the horse keeps pushing you, it's not a bad horse. It's a horse that has no boundaries, but it's asking you, put a boundary. If it were in a natural herd, there's a boundary. And so many of the problem horses I work with that rear and buck and kick, and they've learned how to catch the whip or catch the rope or attack, because they don't like that interference. Mostly, I'll use a squirt gun or something to get the message across. It's funny, but it's my emotional voice. And people used to say, oh, she's the horse whisperer. No, I'm the horse yeller. I have no problem saying, you get out of my space and you stay. Your mother did not teach you manners. And that anger energy makes the horses, especially stallions, are like, oh, I think she's upset with me. And they back off. But you go in with a tough attitude, like a male energy, put a chain over their nose and start jerking, you've just elicited anger in them. So when you can do things, start your communication with humor, with compassion, with empathy, and open up those channels, it's a natural progression of being able to feel and sense what your horse needs.
Now, humor is a really big one. obviously humorous perspective. Humor, you crack a joke at the right moment, and all the tension goes out of a situation because suddenly everyone can see the situation from the outside and the absurdity and the common humanity. However, you can only be humorous when you feel safe.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is tough for people who, for whatever reason, don't feel safe around horses.
Yeah.
And one cannot feel safe until a certain amount of familiarity has happened, until a certain amount of mentorship has happened. People like you or people like me who grew up with horses. What's missing from the I grew up with horses is I was mentored by older horse people when I was young about how to be with horses safely. If that hasn't happened to you, how can you possibly feel safe around an animal that weighs what a truck weighs and solves its problems by running away violently and has a sense of humor, and you were always the butt of the joke? Because horses are humorous, but there's a reason why we call it horseplay. So how do you help people to find that ease when they are coming from a state of unfamiliarity and therefore
Yeah.
actually they are
Not
not safe?
I mean, not everybody can be around horses safely if they can't manage their own energy. And having worked with various populations, for instance, women that have gone through abuse of relationships, if the horse continually walks in front of them and they're used to leading a horse in nature, whatever horse, and they're under any sort of stress, whoever's eye is in front is the decision maker. So you'll watch horses being chased, and horses will drop back to let a horse that's stronger get in front because they don't want to make the decisions. So it's very important to have eye contact. And that's true with most social mammals. Eye contact's the first level. You have to maintain eye contact because you're reading behavior. You're reading what's the feelings. But when you let a horse's eye get in front of you and it starts to be fearful, it's going to run right over you because
Mm,
that's just normal horseplay. I mean, not play, that's just how the rules go. But if
yeah.
that horse never learned that, you need to work on my space, your space, stand still or move. And you don't learn that in a round pen. That makes no sense to a horse. There's an appropriate use of a round pen, but it's not just establishing spatial respect. So the first thing a foal learns when it's born is spatial respect, spatial awareness. It has to stay at its mother's side. And the other mares will push it back to its mother's flank because if they have to take off like now galloping, if that foal's not where it's supposed to be, some horse is going to trip over it and
Mm,
everybody gets injured. So that foal learns very early where to stay. They all do. Then it's my space, your space. And this is what interested me studying so many different herds. So while the cultures could vary, the horse etiquette was almost uniformly taught among everyone. And that was eye contact, nose bump, and then if you're a friend and I need a scratch, a buddy scratch. So you're reinforcing forebrain, hindbrain. You're reinforcing social bonds. And a lot of time when they had time was spent reinforcing social bonds. But the eye contact, so much of it was done with a look. You could see the ears, you could see the tail, but that wasn't what was being read. It was eye. And it started with greetings. Two strange stallions might come and they might posture and do their, digging and all that, but then they look at each other. And if they see an invite, they'll come and they'll smell. And oftentimes they'll say hi, nose to nose, and then they'll do a buddy scratch. No fighting, and then they take off. Other times they see a stallion come in or with an eye and they would see it as a threat. And Robert Vavra did a beautiful movie such as The Nature of Horses with beautiful photography on the Cunard horses. Mares, when I did my early research on social behaviors, it was all about the male horses. It was all about aggressors and fighting and stallions. No one looked at how many mare glances were being given. I could tell you who the social facilitator was by how many glances were given and how many glances of other horses to that horse. It wasn't obvious unless you were watching them look at each other. And that connection was stabilizing the connection. So I don't care what method you use, but start with horse method. It's the easiest. Teach your horse manners. My space, your space. Stand still or move. People are always laughing at my horse. She's 17.3. She's probably the best trained horse in Palm Beach County these days because I find it amusing. She's so smart and she is a very functional horse that I can open her stall door and walk away, go have lunch and come back. She won't leave because she knows she was told to stay in that space. And that's without food in her stall because she's told to stay in that space. And people get surprised when a horse learns my space, your space, and they get rewarded. And this is where you have to reward them, not with food. You reward them with social contacts and a buddy scratch for staying in the space and listening, because whoever gets the biggest space is the one that gets to make all the decisions. So if a horse is walking on top of you, yeah, I would be afraid of a horse like that, because if they don't honor my space, I have been known to turn around and yell at stallions or put duct tape on their lips to say, knock it off. Nothing hitting, just so they can't bite when they try to bite you, because if they don't have a chain over the nose and they've learned to pull on a chain and they've had grooms that have jerked on them, a lot of stallions will try to bite you in the shoulders. So I'm not going to put a chain on a horse's nose. I want you out of my space. Well, if young horses, they'll strike at you. That's not safe. So I put little electrician's tape on their little whiskers, and then they can't open their mouths. And so it completely occupies their brain where they can't think. And I'll say, I'll take it off, but you keep your lips to yourself. So they have to learn as if they were in a horse herd. I'm not going to go bite and chase them. I don't have that capability. But I use a paddock a lot to say, you stay in that corner. You may not come into my space, or I'll put food in. And so there's different ways to teach it depending on the skill level. But if you don't have a horse that respects you on the ground, how do you expect them to respect you when you're on their backs? If you're not safe to them on the ground and save their little behinds a few times, then you can simulate that by having scary things come and move away that you can control. And the horse is like, how'd you do that? How'd you make that go away? They don't know that you can control objects around. And so you can really elevate your relationship on saving your horse's life a few times, which is why oftentimes herds would be thrown in together, wild herds that didn't get along, that were kicking each other to pieces. You put them on a 12-hour van ride together and take them off the trailer, oh, they're all best friends now, because they went through a heightened, stressful event together. And that bonds them. So there's different ways to do that. And I don't recommend, if people do not feel safe in themselves, you can't. But with different populations, you have to be able to be matched up with a horse that's going to help draw that out of you. And so some horses are just very defiant horses, and they are not safe to be around kids that don't feel confident. I just had to send one away today. He's fascinating to me. I love the fact he loves working. He loves my space, your space, did everything right. And I have a little video of him. I gave him a flag, and rather than move away, he's gotten so brave. He was going to hold his ground, and rather than move, he did like a kickboxing up in the air a few times and then kicked it and ran. And then I got really strong with my energy and chased him, and he ran off with his tail in the air going, aren't I brave? But if you saw that, you'd go, he's a dangerous horse. He is dangerous to someone who doesn't understand his behavior. And he's the same horse that wants to not be behind you when you lead. He wants to be in front until I have to yell at him and say, you get out of my space. You are a bad horse. You are a naughty horse. And he's like, okay. But that doesn't mean he's not going to try it again. That kind of horse, not safe for a beginner. But for someone who understands horses, that sees the talent, very entertaining, because he acts like a functional horse, which people don't like that sometimes.
Right. And well, that's where the brilliance comes, isn't it? I want my horses to be challenging me because I want that brilliance. And at the same time, there are times when I need to say to them, dude, in this hour, I really need you. I've got this vulnerable kid here. I really need you to be my partner here. And so much of it's on fairness, it's like I will let them treat me as fair game in other situations within reason, so that I can kind of go to almost telepathically say to them, and I know that I've been fair.
Yeah.
You got to get away with kind of all that stuff. So now I'm setting the boundary for this hour. Be cool.
Yeah.
And then they're like, I'm cool because that's fair. And then I can go out a bit later and say, no, you can be not so cool if you want to be. It's so interesting, but as you say, it's so much of that comes from sort of confidence and familiarity. It's also interesting what you said about people often don't know the real story of the horse. And so generally when I'm going out to clinic or train, everyone says my horse was traumatized and everyone says my horse is sensitive. It's like, well, go figure, every mammal is sensitive. Some are more stoic about how they show it or not show it or hide it, but you can be damn sure that every horse is sensitive. every human is sensitive, every rat is sensitive, and every cat is sensitive, but their style of expression may vary. And then the other ones, they've all been traumatized. It's like, well, that's interesting that that's become so ubiquitous now that if I go into a barn of 20 people in a clinic and they're all saying their horse was traumatized, while it's entirely possible that because time on planet Earth does lead to unpleasant situations, these do not look like horses to me that are cowering in a corner. If they've gone through something, they seem pretty resilient. So shall we not talk about their resilience? Because if we only talk about their trauma, are we maybe writing a script to keep them there? I don't know.
That's interesting.
But what you haven't told me is exactly what you just said. What were the horses' first 2 years? Did they live wild on the mountain? And then they were brought in. Were they raised on a stud farm or were they bottle raised, or how were they socialized? Were they not socialized? Now, of course, you may not know because you bought the horse when he was 9 and the history's in a murky past. But then tell me about the horse's behavior at home, and then maybe we can get to the bottom of it, because this might give us some clues about how to proceed. Are there some holes that need to be filled? Did the horse learn, as you say, the nose bump, the scratch, and forebrain, hindbrain? And should we try that? Should we try that and see if that hole is filled? And if not, should we try other things? So that's why I think your work is really important, because it does bring things down to some really usefully clear bottom lines. You talked about your red tips.
Mm-hmm.
The other ones are blue and
Green. Yeah.
Yeah. What are the blue ones?
The red ones are must know. Read that. Right. The blue is...
Give us some blues.
Okay, the blues are, for instance, young siblings in nature will often babysit their sibling brothers and sisters. In other words, even stallions must babysit their offspring, and the mares go off to eat. And while that doesn't seem important in a domestic world, it is, because every horse has a job. And so they aren't just standing around doing nothing. Mm-hmm. They are directed to do things, and they are very responsible to doing those things. But we don't ever tell a horse, keep track of this horse, or do this or do that. You know, again, my mare is fun because I can put her with any horse and she will give it manners because she learned them somewhere. She's French. I don't know who raised her, but they did a good job because she naturally knows how to be a horse. But when she came in, she was shut down, turned into the corner, didn't want to meet humans because she was a jumper. She'd been put to work. She didn't like where life was going, tried to bite people that came in. I went in and said, wait, you don't even know me. You don't even know me. You should at least give me a chance to meet, you know, and started scratching her. She didn't like that because she was pretty armored and tight, but with a few scents, and that's where using aromatherapy to tie up the brain, she was like, oh, that's really interesting. Smells. And she started to relax, and then she started to realize she could talk, and I wasn't going to get mad at her. And if she was biting because she hurt, I'm going to fix it. And so, you know, those are the kind of tips in there that when your horse is rarely wrong, they're going to communicate things to you. So I'll take a random one. You know, there's a lot. The book's actually going to come out this year in German with the the FS over there. So here's a tip that when weaning foals, for instance, as a group, place an adult teacher horse with them so that they learn the experience of horsedom without just putting them all into, you know, kindergarten and juvenile delinquents and these breeding farms that throw all the foals out when they're weaned. Not good. You just basically threw a bunch of preschoolers out with no teacher. And even an old gelding or an old mare or school mom, older horses teach them. So why are we not using horses to teach? I mean, early on, people don't realize how much behavior is learned from horses. And, you know, as a behaviorist, I remember a stallion that was an Arab stallion that was attacking people. And of course, the horse had learned to jump up on people's backs and do all these cute things. Well, it had been, quote, trained to, it was attacking everything. You try to put it in a round pen, it come after the whip. And not mean, just all games. So I realized all the cues that people had given this horse was smart enough to learn how to override them. So that's not, there was no helpful way to help this one. So I put him out with a bunch of brood mares. And at about, by the end of the week, he was standing at the gate very humbled. And it was interesting watching, these are domestic mares, thoroughbreds. And the old mare snaked her head. I mean, this is very consistent horse behavior. She pinned her ears and snaked her head when they were eating their hay. He didn't know what that meant. No one taught him. He didn't grow up with horses. He grew up with humans that taught him how to jump on their backs. And it just seemed unfair to try to use a human to try to teach him how to be a horse when I got horse teachers here. So, that's another one. Horses are often better teachers than humans, but find a good horse. If the mare is letting her 6-month-old colt mount her, she is not a good mom. She needs to be a better mom. So put that guy with a better mom. So there's a whole lot that if you understand early childhood development of your horse and what it should know, even if you get a rescue, you get it. Let's see what you know. Do you know spatial awareness? Do you know eye contact? Do you know how to communicate? Do you know how to do these things? Because a horse that doesn't, do you know how to greet friends? Do you know how to do a buddy scratch? There's nothing more fun to watch a horse that meets another horse for the first time and have no idea how to do a buddy scratch. And I have videos of that where a pony's trying to get the horse to scratch and the horse is pulling back going, I have no idea what you're doing to me. Why are you biting me? And finally, it's something clicked in the brain. It's like, oh, am I supposed to do that to you? And it's taking bites out of the mane. It had no idea. And now that horse learned it. He was a little too in every horse's space. He'd walk up to a complete strange horse and try to scratch on them. It's like, no, 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 no. Take it back a little bit because they learn behavior. So you have to know first how horses act with each other and what they should know. And I think that's important. And, you get to the green tips. It's nice to know. It's not going to make or break anything, but it's still very helpful to know. For instance, how many neurons are in the horse's nose versus the hind end. It's not critical, but there's probably, one neuron in the brain, proprioceptors in the nose, about 20. So it's very specific. You get to the hind end, it's one neuron in the brain to about 20,000 proprioceptors. So why does your horse pick up the opposite leg? Because it has no idea where it is. It doesn't know. You have to feel it. So there's little things to open up the channels, and all of a sudden the horse picks up the correct leg. So while those are not critical, it really helps you in horse management to understand the biomechanics and the neurophysiology of the horse. So I don't go into great depth because there's other people like Dr. Peters' book on neurophysiology and horse brain, human brain.
Yeah, Stephen Peters. Yeah. Anyone watching and listening, check out Dr. Stephen Peters. Yeah.
There's some great stuff. So I tried to give an overview with tips that are going to help people that this is really critical. Learn it. These are important. And then these are nice to know. And that way people feel what I hear most and interesting from people that don't know much about horses, and then old cowboys from Texas, that have called or written me and said, I just described what they do and been doing for 50 years. And he said, you just described it to a T, because they don't know how to talk about this. They don't know how to talk about that intuition of feeling what the horse is saying and then knowing how to connect to it. And so that's what I tried to do, is not only the way I did it, but understand the way other people that were doing it, how do they do it, put it together in different tools to give people so that they can see what works for them. But understand the horse first.
Brilliant. Well, look, I feel that this was just part one of a greater conversation.
We didn't even get into the consciousness part. That's the fun part.
We didn't get into the consciousness part. We didn't go into the horse welfare part. And so listeners and viewers, when Marianne and we were sitting together in Florida a couple of months ago, and we were talking at some length about horse welfare in the sport world and the fact that the aftercare for thoroughbreds is now becoming a thing, and the racing industry is aware that its social license is, not something it can take for granted anymore. However, the jumper world, the dressage world, is still working somewhat complacently in this regard. And, those of you who know my work obviously know that I deal with a lot of rehab and a lot of second career. And Marianne has been really active in this and working behind the scenes on this, particularly within the sport world. So I want to, if possible, so we're approaching the 2-hour mark, and I wanted to talk about A Horse by Nature. I wanted to plug your book. I wanted people to know who you were. I wanted to turn on, my crowd to you. And by the way, it's Linda Tennington-Jones who said, you've got to do it. And finally I was like, yes, Linda, yes, of course. Because if Linda tells me to do something, of course I jump, even if it takes me a little while. And by the way, I won't be leaving this chair until Ann Simonds tells me I'm allowed to, because even if she leaves the door open, I will stay here, even though there's no food. Allows me to. But all joking aside, I think there's a lot further to go in this conversation. So with your permission, Marianne, could we call this an au revoir as we
Yep.
come to the 2-hour mark, and we will reconvene in a few weeks and go to the next level of the conversation, I think. Because as you say, consciousness, horse welfare, there's a ton of stuff I want to ask you about, observations that you made with the wild horses. So
Absolutely.
can we do it?
Absolutely. And there are things progressing in the sport horse welfare world and things that we started to discuss. There's a lot of things in play right now. So it'll be interesting. Every few weeks things are changing. So yeah.
Good,
Yeah.
because that's, sort of, I think we have reason to be cautiously optimistic, which is
Yeah.
good.
Exactly it. Cautiously optimistic is it. So yeah, no, this is great. And you and I know we could talk for 6 hours, but that's not needed right now.
Well, we
Could do
will talk for 6 hours. We'll just break it up into 2
it
hours.
in little bites. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Well, I enjoyed it very much, Rupert. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much. So yeah, let's just make a date for the next one.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll see you then.
All right.
Thank you
Thanks.
again.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com. It's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.